Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us here at Grace Church. We're continuing on in our series, Waiting on God. And last week, we talked about living in God's desert and waiting on God. And really what we decided on, that based on the life of the Israelites and their wilderness wandering, and they wandered around in the desert, and they waited on God for 4 decades. And we said in our life, that is really anything that is hard, it is uncomfortable, the future is unknown, it's very different, it's not the norm, and it's the space that's in between, right? From where you were to where you are going. And you're pretty sure, this is what makes it living in God's desert and waiting on God, is you're pretty sure, if not absolutely convinced, that God brought you to this place. And so that's why I call it God's desert. And you're waiting on God because He's the one that brought you there. And He's the only one that can get you out of there. And we talked last week that I'm not an expert on this. I want to be a tour guide as somebody who's been down the path and who's walked along a lot of other people that have been down this path of living in God's desert and waiting on God. I want to be a tour guide. And I talked about a hazard last week. A hazard called complaint. That if we're not careful, complaint will overtake our lives, and our life can get disoriented in the desert, right? We all know that if you aren't careful in the desert, things can dry up, and that can happen to your faith, and your life can become disoriented if you choose complaint, if you choose murmuring. But there's a better way, there's a different path. A path that looks harder, a path that doesn't seem natural, that seems like it's impossible even, but that path is trust. That we choose trust over complaint. And when we choose trust over complaint, God is there with us. Because we choose to trust not the path. We don't trust the path. We trust the God that has shown Himself to be trustworthy over and over and over in our lives. Now maybe you say, "Oh, Aaron, I'm not a believer," or "I'm not sure I believe in this God. I don't know." And I would say to this, the psalmist says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." Taste and see. And if you're walking through a desert that you think, well, maybe God led me here. If you're living in God's desert and you're waiting on God, I would still urge you to trust in God. Just let Him prove Himself to you. And as far as about being at Grace Church, you can belong here at Grace Church before you believe. We would love to be part of your faith journey because we don't want your faith to dry up wherever it's at. We don't want your life to be disoriented. We want you to be connected deeply with Jesus and His life-changing grace. And the desert is a great place because deep connection can be formed there. Great spiritual transformation happens there. But sometimes it becomes too much. It becomes too much. Last week I was telling you guys about my story, about one of the times that I've been living in the desert waiting on God. We had lost our job. Heather and I had lost our job. We didn't know where to turn. We were choosing to trust. I mean, after a lot of complaining, so don't let me sugarcoat it. A lot of complaining and then choosing to trust, and God provides us with a job. And so we move, we find a place that only God could have provided. We start school. There are all these things going on. I start a ministry. I'm a youth pastor. Seminary's beginning, and it's fun and exciting. Kids are coming to know the Lord. The ministry is expanding. We're bringing kids in who desperately need Jesus and who desperately need the love of Jesus. And things are just going great until they're not. Because it was hard. I mean, even living in the desert when things are going good in the desert, they're still hard, right? We were barely able to scrape by. I had 2 kids at the time making $24,000 a year, like in 2007 or 8, not in the 70s. $24,000 a year, no benefits. My wife was a school teacher that was uncredentialed, working on her credentials. So I was going to school during the day. She was going to school during the night. She would hand me the baby, and I mean, we hardly saw each other. But we were doing it. Like we were making it work. We were living in the desert. We were trusting God. And then I started getting a little more pushback. I started getting pushback from our leadership at our church. And they would say things to me like, hey, who are these kids you're bringing? Hey, why we have these big problems at church, Aaron? There are scuff marks and trash left on Wednesday night. I'm like, guys, people are getting saved. They're getting baptized. Like, people that need Jesus are getting Jesus. And they're like, yeah, but those scuff marks, things of real importance. And it starts to mount. It starts to mount. We barely have enough money. We don't see each other enough, but we're still making it. And then something happens. And I'm going to tell you, and it's going to seem silly, but our dryer breaks. Our dryer breaks in the middle of the winter. And so now we have no dryer. Do you know how much it's going to cost to fix it? $75. I don't have that kind of cash. I'd have had to take out a loan. I mean, at one point, somebody stole our debit card number and they tried to buy something at Coach Luggage. And they tried, you could tell they tried it 10 or 12 times. They started with $5,000 and then $3,000 and we, insufficient funds. And we found out that the cheapest thing on Coach Luggage was a $25 keychain, and they tried buying that and they couldn't because there was insufficient funds to buy a $25 keychain in our debit account. Crime doesn't pay to steal my identity. Right? But our dryer breaks. And so I'm having to hang up the clothes in the middle of winter, and it's humid, but it's also cold, and they don't dry. It takes days and days and days. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I had a full-on meltdown with God, and I let him have it. I told him exactly what I thought about this situation, exactly how it was. I had a meltdown. And that happens in the desert, right? That happens in the desert, right? It might not be the dryer breaking. It might be one more fight with your spouse that you're not sure, maybe this is the last one. It might be one more bill that comes that you weren't, $45 for an aspirin in the hospital, that you weren't sure how you were going to pay all the other bills, but you definitely don't know how you're going to pay this one. It may be one more time that your child comes in after curfew. It may be one more treatment that you were supposed to go through that was supposed to fix things. One more medical test that was supposed to give you the answer. But how it happens, it doesn't matter. You reach your breaking point. And all of us reach our breaking point when we're in the desert, right? Because defeat is contagious. It's contagious in ministry, right? Whenever defeat happened in my life, the ministry suffered because I was getting all this other pressure, and then the dryer breaks, and then I get one more talking to by church leadership, and then we had a couple that were really helping out in the youth ministry. They move states, and everybody feels it. Defeat is contagious on teams, in families, in your organization, in your church. Why are people up and leaving? Why are people so unhappy? Because in the desert, you reach your breaking point. You reach your breaking point. And for the Israelites, for Moses, the leader, this came after the Israelites were complaining. They chose complaint instead of trust. And they were complaining and complaining and complaining. They complained about the situation instead of trusting. Instead of trusting a thing that had happened over and over and over, God's provision, they chose complaint. And that pushed Moses over the edge. And it says this, he has led these people for years, for decades. And it says this in Numbers 11, verse 10. It says that he has led them for decades. He has cared for them. And look at verse 10. It says, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Now, I think Moses probably either influenced or wrote this, because what he says is not a displeased thing. Like what he says is like, hey, the anger of the Lord blazed. And he's like, and I was kind of upset too. But look what he says. Let's look at what Moses says. Then Moses said to the Lord. Now notice he doesn't even say to the people. He's already talked to the people over and over and over. He's talked to them until he can't talk anymore. And so he says to the Lord, and that's an important piece. Remember that. Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay this burden of all the people on me? Did I conceive of all these people? Did I give them birth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that I swore to give to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all these people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once. If I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. Now that does not sound like Moses was displeased. That sounds like Moses had it up to here. He goes to God. He goes to God and he has all these questions for God. I mean, he lays it out in this emotional meltdown. He has the question, why have you done this to me, he says in verse 11. Why have you done this to me? Why have you treated me this way? He says, do you not care about me? Why do you not care about me, God? Why did you do this? Why do you not care about me? Question 2. Question 3, is this really my responsibility? And the implication is, this wasn't my decision, God. This was yours. This wasn't my solution to the problem. This was yours. God, you did this. Why am I now responsible? If you remember back, Moses didn't ask to be the leader. Moses didn't ask to free his people. God chose him. There's so many things that Moses didn't ask for, and God laid these burdens on him, and God is free to do what he wants. But the implication is here, I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. Why is this my responsibility? Right? Why did you put this on me? Why do you not care about me? Why am I having to do all this anyways? Question 5 is this, or question 4, how can I do what is being asked of me? How can I do this thing that is being asked of me, God? How can I provide meat for these people? How can I do the thing that, so he said, you gave them to me. I didn't really want them. And now they're asking for meat, and how can I do this? And then he finishes it with the 5th and final question that really gives insight to how he's feeling. He basically says, God, is this how you're going to treat me? Because if this is how you're going to treat me, I would rather you kill me. I would rather you kill me than keep treating me like this. Like, do me a favor. Kill me now. Like he says, if you found any favor in me, if you have any kindness towards me, I mean, he says, it feels like you're just punishing me, that you hate me. But if I have if there's any grace left for me, just take my life. End it all now. That would be the nicest thing you could do. That's what he says to God. And the whole point of the meltdown is this: God, I can't do this thing alone. I cannot carry this burden. It is too heavy. Now all the other emotion is tied to it. It feels like you hate me. Why am I doing it? Be nice and just off me. Like all the emotion surrounds it deals with the reality. The real reality of God, I cannot carry this burden. You have given me a burden that I cannot carry. And that's exactly the point. You see, in God's desert, waiting on God, God shows you something about yourself. Right? And God shows you something about the task that he's put before you, that it is too heavy for you. He shows you that you can't carry this burden, the burden of life, the burden of leadership, the burden of loving people, the burden that God has placed on you. That you can't do it. You can't carry it. It's too heavy to carry alone. We've all experienced this, and we've all seen it in other people. I remember the youth group kid that just wanted to be at church all the time. He would find any excuse to be any place other than his home because the burden there was too great for him to carry. I mean, he would say as much, Aaron, can we do something else? I don't want to go home. I can't go home. The burden's too heavy. Right? I've walked alongside parents of children with special needs, and at some point, if it's not the medical bills, it's the medical test. If it's not the medical tests, it's the time away from home. If it's not the time away from home, it's the time that they have to spend at home, not having a social life. If it's not them feeling bad, if it's not that, it's about them feeling bad for their child. If it's not them feeling bad for their special needs child, it's feeling bad for their typical siblings. If it's not them feeling bad about that, it's feeling bad. I mean, it's whatever it is, and it gets so heavy that I've had them come and say to me, Aaron, I can't carry this burden. It's too heavy. You see, this is the point. I wish I could say to you, now when you're in God's desert, you might experience this. When you're waiting on God, this might happen to you. I wish I had that news. Except I don't even really wish I had that news. I'm going to tell you, when you're in God's desert, and when you are waiting on God, there will come a time when you have the meltdown, when you cry out to God, when you are real and open and honest and you say, listen, God, and it might be with teeth gritted. I can't do this alone. I can't bear this burden you gave me. And some people say, well, Moses' language is exaggerated, but if you've ever been in God's desert waiting on God, if it's ever been a really hard time, you might have even said those same words. God, have some kindness to me. Give some kindness to me and just take me now. I'm better off to my family not being here. I'm better off in this situation. I can't bear this burden, and it would be better if I just wasn't around. For most of us, at some point we've reached that spot where that's not an exaggerated way. And you say, Lord, I just can't carry this burden. And you may say to yourself, well, okay, Moses had a meltdown. I've had a meltdown. I don't know how to feel about the meltdown. Well, the meltdown is necessary, and the meltdown, if you've had the meltdown, you're in good company. Because you may get, people will get upset to me. They'll come into my office, they'll go, oh, shucky darns. Well, some bad stuff's happening. It's like, is that really how you feel? No. They try to put on a good face. Well, it's just, some things I just don't really like. Like they try to be like Moses when he was describing him, and Moses was displeased. I am displeased right now with Jesus. I am displeased with my life. I am displeased with the desert. I am displeased with the burden that I'm having to bear. Let me tell you, you can't keep that facade up forever. Because when you have the meltdown, you're in good company. You're in good company. Moses did it. That's God's man. Elijah, if you look at 1 Kings, Elijah is doing incredible stuff for the Lord. He's a prophet of God. In fact, he had taken on the entire set of prophets who were false prophets that were running rampant in Israel. He had taken them on. It's a great story in 1 Kings 18, right? Elijah says, hey, you choose a bull and I'll choose a bull, and we're going to see, without setting a fire, we're going to see which one is devoured by the fire. And you're going to pray to your God, and I'm going to pray to my God, and we're going to see, right? And so he has all these prophets, these false prophets, and they're lipping around, and they're doing dances, and they're doing incantations, and cutting themselves, and falling all over themselves. And Elijah is like, he is right there, man. He knows exactly what's going on. He's like, maybe your God, your false God's in the bathroom. Maybe he stepped out to go on vacation. Maybe he's taking a journey, and so it's okay. And then he has his bull that he's going to sacrifice, and he has them dump water on the wood, and he makes a spectacle of it, and then God brings fire down and destroys the bull and the wood and the stones and the water. It's this huge thing. And everybody turns on the prophets, and they kill all the false prophets like God had told them to. And he is riding high. God is doing these miracles around him, and then he gets word that the king and queen of Israel are out to get him, and they promise, we will not rest until you die. And he gets scared. And we read about, this is the guy that just saw all these miracles, right? It's like Moses, who's been talking to God and been communing with God, and then he has this meltdown. Well, Elijah has a meltdown. 1 Kings 19, verse 3 says, then he was afraid, and he rose and he ran for his life, and he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. He says, God, it's over. Take me now. Take me now, because it is better that I'm dead. I have made no impact. I've done nothing good. I can't handle it. I can't bear this burden. You go, well, maybe that's a Moses, and maybe that's Elijah. Well, let me say, the King David, right? King David, a man who God describes as a person after his own heart. He has meltdowns, a couple of them. Psalm 69, verse 1 and 2 says, save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink down in the mire where there is no foothold. I've come in the deep waters where the flood sweeps over me. He's like this. I am drowning. I can't bear this burden. I cannot do this thing that you've called me to do. In Psalm 55, David is betrayed by a friend. He's betrayed by a friend, and he says this, give ear to my prayer, O Lord, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint. I moan because of the noise of my enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Have you ever been just scared for your life? Like just afraid all the time? Fear and trembling have come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. That's not hey, my Facebook friend said something mean to me. That is deep, deep disappointment. And this is David going, God, I need your help because I cannot bear the burden that has been laid on me. David, in verse 13, or chapter 13, he has a meltdown, and it echoes the words that the band U2 sing. How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul? How much can I just console myself, God, and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? How long? How long will you forget me? How long must I bear this burden by myself, is what he's saying. I can't bear this burden. Well, again, the meltdown is a thing that you have to have. A meltdown is a place that you have to come to. Now, if you say, well, I don't know, can I use strong language with God? Yes, use the strongest language. Use as strong a language. You know what? He's heard it. I promise. Use as strong as language as you can with him. Pour your heart out. Tell him how it's unfair. Tell him how tell him that you can't bear it. I mean, maybe you go so far as to ask God to take your life. God doesn't despise these meltdowns. In fact, I think he welcomes them. I think he welcomes them by how he treats the people that have them. Because if you look at Moses, after he has this meltdown and says, I can't bear this burden alone, the Lord says, okay, I'm going to divide your leadership. And he invites 70 more leaders. 70 more leaders to take responsibility for these people and he gives them 140 more ears to complain to. He divides his leadership. He doesn't really divide it, he multiplies it. Because they begin to prophesy. Right? They begin to speak from the Lord. And then he reminds Moses, listen, you can't feed 600,000 people, but I can. It doesn't worry me. I can do it. If you look at David, in Psalm 69, towards the end it says this, for the Lord listens to the needy. He doesn't despise his captive people. He goes on to say, listen, he does the thing that he says he's going to do. He will deliver those people that cry out to him. After the betrayal in Psalm 55, you get this familiar passage. It's going to sound familiar if you've read the New Testament. In Psalm 55:22, it says, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. You see, Peter, the Apostle Peter, who has lived in God's desert and who had waited on God, who had had a meltdown. If you want to read his meltdown, it's the end of the Gospel of John. He has a meltdown when Jesus keeps asking him, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? He's like, oh, you know all things. He has a meltdown. Years later, he echoes David. And he says, humble yourself, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. Okay, he's saying, humble yourself under the hand of God who can bear the burden that you are bearing. Who can pick you up, you and the burden, and who can handle all the burdens that you have. It says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so at the proper time he may exalt you, casting your anxieties, that's a better word, casting your anxieties on him because he cares for you. The meltdown, I think God welcomes. The meltdown is welcomed by God because Jesus even says in Matthew 11, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, who have a heavy, heavy burden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. For you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. See, I think God honors the meltdown. I think God doesn't just honor it, I think he anticipates it. I don't think he just anticipates it, I think he is waiting for it. He is waiting for you and for me in his desert, waiting on him to get real with him. Because open and honest prayer, you know what it means? It means you've opened the dialogue. Even if it means that you're going to use strong words and you're going to ask a bunch of questions and you're going to tell him how unfair it is. But it gets you looking in the right direction. It gets you looking towards him. It gets you talking to him. I'm going to be honest. When the dryer broke, I had a meltdown. And let me tell you, football player Aaron came out when I had the meltdown. It was not, oh, golly gee whiz, God. It was not, oh, shucks. This is kind of hard. I'm displeased. This was just take me now. I have a $30,000 insurance policy, God. That'll solve our problems. Take me now. Take me now. And let me just tell you, I prayed the prayer and things got better. I can't even tell you how. You know how I can tell you they didn't get better is my circumstances didn't change. We still had a broken dryer. We had a broken dryer for the next 9 months. We saved up $75 and we fixed it. It's one of the best days of my life. My circumstances didn't change, but I was looking to God and I wasn't carrying the burden by myself. When you have your meltdown and you pray and you have that exchange with God, you're turning in the right direction. When you tell him you can't bear the burden that he's put upon you, and you ask him for help, he will not forget you. He will not forget you. He will help you. Because you've opened the connection, this dialogue. You've deepened your connection with him. Your faith gets stronger when you are open and honest and even angry with God. So when you run across the desert, in the desert, when you run across the meltdown, cry out to God. Be open, be honest, be ready to accept God's provision. And that's a great place to begin. You say, well, what do I do with God's provision, Aaron? What do I do when God gives me the provision? I'd love to tell you, but for that, you got to come back next week. Love you guys. See you next week.